Ferrari may have just opened the one door that could completely blow up Formula One. Because for months, whenever Max Verstappen's future came up, the same names kept getting mentioned. Mercedes, maybe Aston Martin, maybe even McLaren if things got really crazy. But Ferrari, that always felt like fantasy. Not anymore, because when you actually look at the timing, this suddenly starts to make a lot more sense than people want to admit. Red Bull are losing key people. The structure around Max looks weaker than it did a year ago. The new generation of cars still hasn't exactly won him over. And Ferrari? Ferrari know Lewis Hamilton is not a forever project. So this is no longer just about whether Max would ever leave Red Bull. It's about which team is already planning for the moment he does. And Ferrari might be much deeper in that conversation than anyone expected. The biggest reason this story is gaining traction is simple. Red Bull no longer feels untouchable. For years, Verstappen and Red Bull looked like one of those combinations that would last until the end of an era. The car was dominant. The structure was strong. The people around him were trusted. Everything was built to keep Max comfortable and keep Red Bull winning. Now that picture looks very different. The team has already seen major changes behind the scenes. Important figures have left. The sense of stability that defined the Verstappen era just doesn't feel as solid anymore. And when that starts happening, every top team in the paddock begins asking the same question. If Max ever becomes available, do we have a plan? That's why this matters. Because once the strongest driver on the grid is even loosely linked to movement, this stops being a Red Bull story and becomes a whole driver market story. And Ferrari would be crazy not to think about it. Now let's be clear about something. This does not mean Ferrari are pushing Lewis Hamilton out. And it does not mean a Verstappen deal is suddenly close. What it means is Ferrari are doing what elite teams are supposed to do, thinking ahead. Hamilton is one of the biggest names the sport has ever seen, but Ferrari also know they cannot build their entire long-term future around emotion. At some point, they have to decide what the next chapter looks like. And if there is even a tiny chance that Max Verstappen could be part of that chapter, you do not ignore it. Because this is the kind of opportunity that almost never appears. And most teams spend years searching for a driver who can define an era. Verstappen already has. So if Ferrari believe there's a realistic window where Hamilton eventually steps away, and Verstappen becomes genuinely open to a new challenge, then, of course, they are going to watch that situation closely. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The obvious Ferrari future has always looked like Ollie Behrman. Young, fast, already in the system. Easy story, clean succession plan. But Max Verstappen changes the entire equation. Because Behrman is a smart future bet. Verstappen is a proven championship weapon. And there's a massive difference between planning for tomorrow and suddenly being offered one of the safest winning bets in modern Formula One. That's why Ferrari even thinking about this is such a huge statement. It tells you that if Verstappen ever reaches the market, Ferrari do not want to be the team that sits back and says, "We should have tried." They want to at least be in the room. Now imagine the bigger picture. A Ferrari lineup built around Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen would instantly become one of the most explosive pairings this sport has seen in years. Two elite drivers, two drivers with massive status, two drivers who absolutely would not arrive to play a supporting role. And that is exactly why this would be so fascinating. Because on pure speed, star power, and title potential, it would be unbelievable. But politically, internally, that could become one of the most dangerous garages in Formula One. Ferrari are already under pressure to prove they can deliver at the very top consistently. Leclerc has invested years into this project. Hamilton arrived because Ferrari want to win now, not someday. And if Ferrari ever moved from Hamilton to Verstappen, that would not be a normal driver swap. That would be Ferrari admitting the next phase of this team has to be even more ruthless than the current one. And maybe that is exactly where Formula One is heading. Because look at the alternatives. Mercedes will always be mentioned whenever Verstappen's future comes up. That link is obvious. McLaren suddenly looks more interesting too, especially if more Red Bull connections keep ending up there. Reuniting Max with trusted people in a fast car is the kind of idea that gets serious very quickly. Aston Martin have had the dream attached to them before as well. So Ferrari's angle is different. Ferrari's pitch would not simply be, come here because we want you. It would be, come here because you could define the next era of the biggest team in Formula One. And that is a very different kind of temptation. For some drivers, it would be too much pressure. For Verstappen, that might be exactly the kind of challenge that becomes interesting if Red Bull's project keeps losing momentum. That doesn't mean it happens tomorrow. It doesn't even mean it happens at all. But the fact this conversation is alive tells you something important. The Verstappen market is no longer theoretical. Teams are looking. Teams are planning. And Ferrari are reportedly one of them. That alone changes the temperature of the paddock. Because once Ferrari start preparing for a future beyond Hamilton, and once Verstappen is viewed as a realistic name worth monitoring, the whole driver market starts shifting around one possibility. Not whether Max is loyal, not whether Red Bull can still convince him, not even whether Ferrari would be chaos with two superstars in one garage. The real question is this: if the one driver every team secretly wants ever becomes available, who will be bold enough to move first? And if Ferrari are already thinking about that answer, then this story is a lot more serious than it first sounded. Because this might not be a rumor about replacing Hamilton. It might be the first sign of Formula One's next power move.